and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi, everyone.
Dennis, what are you starting with this week?
Well, it's the Levelling Up Bill. It's back in the headlines with new announcements concerning planning powers and housing. Here's the detail. Changes to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill will hand new planning powers to councils and could see the introduction of penalties for developers who are failing to deliver housing despite having planning approval, the government has announced. In an announcement detailing new measures in the bill, the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Local Communities claimed that the policies would see homes built in the right places with the right infrastructure and protect the environment. According to the government, the new provisions will tackle slow build-out by developers, including consideration of new financial penalties for companies failing to deliver housing. Greenbelt protections will also be strengthened in the bill, and the new guidance will be set out that local authorities are not required to review Greenbelt to deliver homes. In addition, brownfield land will be prioritised for development, and a review will be launched into how brownfield sites are used. The government also said it will ensure valued landscapes such as national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and the Green Belt remain protected through robust national and local planning policies. Alongside these reforms, the government plans to launch a consultation on whether planning permission should be required for new short-term lets, especially in tourist hotspots, and will pursue a registration scheme for these properties. According to the government, housing targets remain an important part of the planning system, and the government will consult on how these can better take account of local density. Now, commenting on the plans, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, Michael Gove, said there was an urgent need to deliver new homes, but the planning system is not working as it should. The latest iteration of the bill is included in the bulletin, and of course we will report back on this important legislation as it proceeds through Parliament.
Now, taken from the LGA bulletin, second homeowners in Cornwall could be charged twice the normal rate of council tax in a move approved by Cornwall Council. Cornwall could become the second council in England to introduce these premiums, following North Yorkshire Council earlier in the year. The move is subject to the government's Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill gaining royal assent, however. Sticking with Levelling Up, as Dennis mentioned, mandatory house building targets have been scrapped by Secretary Michael Gove, with targets only being advisory. In another change to the bill, councils will be allowed to introduce registration schemes for short-term holiday lets, and there will be a consultation on allowing them to require a change of use planning application if there is a switch from residential to short-term Airbnb type use. And finally, in this segment, a campaign group has begun a High Court fight after complaining about a government failure to implement Grenfell Tower inquiry recommendations relating to people living in high-rise flats who have disabilities. CLADAG has raised concerns relating to recommendations that owners of high-rise residential buildings should prepare personal emergency evacuation plans for all people with disabilities. Now, Dennis, you've been following the history of the Cumbria Coalmine Case, and indeed you've mentioned it in the Grapevine several times previously. What's the latest on this?
Yes, last Wednesday evening, the government announced that the UK will build its first new coal mine for 3 decades in Whitehaven in Cumbria, despite objections locally, across the UK, and from around the world. This is a hugely controversial decision. Here's more on this. The UK will build its first new coal mine for 3 decades at Whitehaven in Cumbria, despite objections locally, across the UK, and from around the world. Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, gave the green light for the project last Wednesday evening, paving the way for an estimated investment of £165 million that will create about 500 new jobs in the region and produce 2.8 million tonnes of coking coal a year, largely for steelmaking. The mine will also produce an estimated 400,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions a year, increasing the UK's emissions by the equivalent of putting 200,000 cars on the road. The vast majority of the coal produced will be for export, as most UK steel producers have rejected the use of the coal, which is high in sulphur and surplus to their needs. The government said the mine was possible within the UK's climate legislation, which requires the UK to reach net zero emissions by 2050, as operations will shut down by 2049. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has clearly faced down objections from Green MPs within his own party. The decision will be welcomed, however, by Conservative right-wingers for whom the mine has become talismanic. The miners' backers have been trying to get the project off the ground since 2014. It got local approval in 2020 and was greenlit by ministers in 2021. But for the past 2 years, the project has been beset by planning delays as the government rescinded its approval as it prepared to take on the presidency of global climate talks ahead of the COP26 UN Climate Summit in Glasgow in November 2021. The UK government handed over its presidency of the UN climate negotiations last month to Egypt, a year after the widely lauded COP26 resolved to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, an achievement that COP President Alok Sharma warned was fragile. A report by the International Energy Agency last year, commissioned by the UK government whilst it was president of COP, found that no new fossil fuel development, either coal, oil or gas, could take place if the government was to remain within the 1.5 centigrade limit. Sharma told the Observer last weekend he was firmly against the mine. He said, over the past 3 years, the UK has sought to persuade other nations to consign coal to history because we're fighting to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and coal is the most polluting energy source. A decision to open a new coal mine would send completely the wrong message and be an own goal, he said. This proposed new mine will have no impact on reducing energy bills or ensuring our energy security. Now, this decision will be much criticised and creates the impression that the UK is hypocritical about its promises and commitments on climate change.
Well, it's certainly generated a significant amount of debate, that's for sure. Now, the Online Safety Bill is once again back in Parliament, having been delayed for 5 months. Actually, it's rather hard to believe that it was Theresa May who proposed the provision, and as The Guardian rather astonishingly highlights, it survived 4 Prime Ministers and 7 departmental secretaries. The regulation proposed in the bill is aimed at ensuring platforms have systems and processes in place to deal with illegal and harmful content and their associated risk. The bill primarily does this by introducing duties of care to some user-to-user services and search engines. The bill also imposes duties on such providers in relation to the protection of users' rights to freedom of expression and privacy. Under the provisions of the bill, all regulated services will have a duty of care in relation to illegal content, and if services are deemed accessible by children, a duty to protect children from harm. There will also be provision around the categorization of regulated services, which requires a lot more clarity before I can comprehend and disseminate it, that's for sure. Certainly, the LGA is urging the government to set out their proposed categories of harmful content to children and adults as soon as possible, and consult with independent experts to define and prioritise that harmful content. So Dennis, I understand the procedure on how to address judges is changing. What's the latest?
Well, yes, out goes some formality and in comes less formal language. It's probably a good thing. So here's the detail. District judges will no longer be addressed as Sir or Madam, as the judiciary attempts to modernise the language of the courtroom. In a notice published last week, the senior judiciary said that judges should be addressed in court or in tribunal hearings simply as judge. The new direction will apply to masters, open tribunal judges, employment and employment appeal tribunal judges, district judges, and first-tier tribunal judges. Lord Chief Justice Lord Burnett of Malden and Senior President of Tribunals Sir Keith Lindblom said, the move away from Sir or Madam involves modern and simple terminology reflecting the important judicial role while maintaining the necessary degree of respect. We also hope that this change in language will assist litigants in person involved in court and tribunal proceedings. They added that the change does not affect judicial titles, which have a basis in statute, or the way in which judges record their decisions. In the tribunals, non-legal members should continue to be addressed as Sir or Madam. Now, a number of law firms have removed gendering language in correspondence and have already switched away from the use of dear sirs in letters. So, what do you think of all of these changes, Lady Helen?
Well, I think language develops, and so should we. Although I rather like the sound of Lady Helen, I'm not sure I could entirely live up to the title, Dennis. So finally from me, the local government lawyer ran an article on Friday in which both LLG and ADSO are quoted in respect of remote meeting provision. Listeners will be more than aware of both our campaigns to enable permanent provision for local authorities. LLG and ADSO have consistently written to the various Secretary of States as to when the call for evidence will be responded to, and have often been told shortly. Now, however, the clever folks at the local government lawyer have noticed that the terminology has shifted. Philip Holt points out that in January 2022, then local government minister Kemi Badenoch said in an answer to a written question that the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities was considering the responses to its call for evidence on local authority remote meetings, and that the government would respond shortly. However, in a response to a written question from another Conservative MP, Richard Fuller, local government minister Lee Rowley said on the 2nd of December that the government was still considering the responses and would only be issuing its response in due course. From our perspective and that of ADSO's, councillors are being forced to navigate challenging weather, illness, the environmental impact of travel to meetings, problem with attending meetings due to industrial action, and competing demands on their time, whilst officers are grappling with quorum and political balance. Commons debate has recently seen support for remote planning meetings in the context of levelling up. We already have provision for remote school admission appeal panels. Are we really to wait for remote provision to drip through piecemeal, or will the government step up and provide the sweeping provision so desperately needed? And on that rather disappointing note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on that, the items discussed today, and many more besides by going to bulletin number 45, available on the LRG website now. Next week will be our last podcast of 2022, and Dennis and I will do our best to try and make it festive. So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me too.
Thank you for listening. Have a good week.